All right. Erev Tov, everyone. Welcome to the Or Zarua Beit Midrash and the extended Beit Midrash out there in Zoom world. We are in a fantastic sugya concerning the revelation of our Torah. We're talking about the passages within the 9th chapter of Masechet Shabbat. So one's first question could be, why is the Torah about Exodus chapter 19 and the revelation of the Torah within Masechet Shabbat? Interesting question of Shabbat. We said last time we got together during the first session about this sugya is Shabbat is an organizing principle. Shabbat is the organizing framework for the entire Jewish people. 7 days, periods. Shabbat is also used as a term within the Torah for week. Sheva Shabbatot Timimot Tihiena. When we talk in this week's Parsha, Emor, about counting 7 weeks, we don't use the word Shavua. We use the word Shabbat. Organizing principle not only for the Jewish people, but for the world. 7-day cycles. This was not always the case, by the way, in the ancient world. You had 9-day cycles and alternative day cycles, depending on which ruler was trying to
also had 14
create
days.
calendrical reality.
There were 14-day cycle in Babylonia.
Yeah. So you had different ones, and the assertion of such a cycle was among the brilliant ideas of the Jewish people. What can we say? We have a 7-day week that carried on and forward. And the Sabbath is central to that, and we count up towards the Sabbath, but we're counting days between Pesach and what becomes the date for the giving of the Torah, which is directly mentioned within our sugya. The 6th of Sivan is assigned as the day the Torah is given. If you recall, the last time around, we made a connection also to the beginning of this chapter, despite the fact that we didn't have a Mishnah, that is the text from the 2nd century CE, upon which all Talmudic commentary will stem or base itself. Not actually, because the discursive conversations within a chapter of the Talmud, they can be based very much on a Mishnah, and they are organized. The Gemara discussions, the Talmudic discussions are organized between entries of the Mishnah. But once I start discussing something the Mishnah said, I might have associated teachings. Associated teachings because the same sage said different teachings. Associated teachings because thematically something might relate. Associated teachings that we're claiming, or I'm claiming, are sometimes placed within the context of discussions for the purpose of relating to the very material that's being discussed on a kind of metaconceptual level. What happens with the 9th chapter of Shabbat is that we're starting to discuss the ideas of purity and impurity. Or as we said last time around, the ideas about being ready ritually to engage in communal ritual, to embrace the community, literally to embrace your beloved, because we're talking about the times that men and women separate from each other. Within the structure of family laws in Israel, we have periods of Tahara and Tumah. We have ready to be physically interactive with each other. We have times that men and women separate. While those are relegated to the worlds of bodily excretions and times of the menstrual cycle within the months, the idea that we're ready versus not in a state of preparedness is part and parcel of the system of Tahara and Tuma. At least from a religious studies phenomenon perspective, we're asking ourselves questions about this area of the Torah's concern. It might have very well been, if we didn't say it as explicitly last week, that our ancient ancestors absolutely thought that there was some type of spiritual muck that was part and parcel of Tuma. We have to give space for such a conception, and that by washing it off with natural waters, as we gathered them in what are called mikvaot today, you might have had baths that didn't qualify for an official mikvah as Jewish law calls for, a mikvah being a pool of living waters, at least living waters mixed in with some water that you've collected in another kind of container. But beyond that, we can conceive of human religiosity that says that at this point, since I do this purification ritual, I move myself back into a state of Tahara, I then move into a readiness factor and move into what we might call a kavanah zone, an intentional zone of being able to participate in community ritual. And we get the hints within these discussions in the Gemara that are sorting it out between men and women about human beings, about the Jewish people's readiness, preparedness, purity to be at Mount Sinai and receive the Torah from God. And what's part and parcel of this whole system? Times when we are not ready and times when we are, times when we are in Tumah and times when we have the state of Tahara, that is time itself. The number of days that one remains in a state of Tumah versus going to the living waters and purifying oneself, or whatever purification ritual is called for. There are several different types in the Torah, which we won't get into right now. But those are matters of days. These are matters of time. How many days must she count before the man and the wife could rejoin for the romantic intercourse that comes in the midst of marriage? How many days does a man who's had a seminal emission at night have to wait in order to then go to the mikveh, in order to become prepared and ready after a ritual bath? Since we're talking about time and days and calculating those, a very deep discussion of how many days did they prepare for the giving of the Torah? How many days was it that they needed to be in a state of Tahara, that men and women needed to be separate from each other? And which days on the calendar were they? Come to also inform the conversation so that it's not just number of days and how Moses seems to, and we'll get back to this part of the text in a second, add a third day when God said, only make yourselves ready, hayom umachar, today and tomorrow. But it's also a matter of which day on the calendar. Because at this point, the rabbis within the Sugya can say, important to us is the idea that we have a certain number of months that we are calling our own in the Hebrew calendar. They are, in the larger cultural sense and project, really affirming this lunar solar calendar that they have created, and they're doing so in the various Masechtot across Moed, across this whole, let's say if we're in one Masechet, we're in one tractate, in this order of Mishnah, which includes Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is called Yoma, and Sukkah, which is for Sukkot, and other Megillah that we read for Purim and has information in it about Torah reading in general, as we live on Shabbat rhythms and we come to Shul to read Torah. That's outlined in Masechet Megillah in the Mishnah and then expanded upon in the Gemara over there. So back here in Shabbat, it only makes sense that all of these Masechtot taken together in this order of the Mishnah that includes all the tractates about the holidays, that they're designing the calendar. And here are the notes again of those, quote unquote, committees of rabbis who are the leaders of Am Yisrael, who are establishing this after the destruction of the temple, who are at Yavne and all the places that the sages then subsequently find themselves, both in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, particularly, because here we are in the Babylonian Talmud, affirming the calendar and what's called the intercalation. And they have to design not only the 7-day cycle for each of the years and design the 7 of 19 years cycle with the Jewish calendar to intercalate, to add a month of Adar so that the month becomes a pregnant month. Shana Me'uberet, 7 of 19 years, to make sure that we're on the solar kind of timing of keeping the festival of the spring in the spring. That has to be Passover falls in the spring all the time because it's called Chag HaAviv, the festival of the spring. So we get notes here and there in the various tractates about which day exactly did this happen. We want to make sure the Chag happens and it's accepted by all of Am Yisrael, Babylonia, Eretz Yisrael in the land of Israel. By the way, now we have Jews in Rome, we have Jews in Egypt, we have Jews in Yemen, we have Jews on the peninsula over there. So we are looking to this source as being interested in the question, which exact day was it? And we're not at this point convinced that they're arguing about whether it could be the 6th or the 7th of Sivan, because they are grappling with any 2 days of Yontif in the diaspora kind of reality. But maybe for this holiday, since we know that there's an idea of having 2 days outside of the land of Israel, maybe they are saying a little bit. Could have been on the first day of this holiday, could have been on the second day of this holiday. What if it came on the second day of the holiday? So Shavuot becomes a reminiscence of the days of preparation, like Moses said, and then Revelation. What's the implication, in other words, of saying it could be the 6th or it could be the 7th of Sivan? The 6th might become a day that has a unique kind of quality of what we're really celebrating, as opposed to what we know as the now quote-unquote rabbinic attachment of just the giving of the Torah, and let's celebrate Shavuot for 2 days because that is the day of the giving of the Torah, and the rabbis here are arguing the 6th or the 7th, and either of those days, according to Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim that we looked at a table last week, remember, and they have different days in order to get to the day of Revelation itself. But meanwhile, everybody agreed that it was on a Shabbat that we got the Torah. On a Shabbat, we got the Torah, but is that still meaning that we agree that it's the 6th or the 7th? And couldn't the 6th have been celebrating the notion of Moses's taking and making the people get into a state of readiness, and the 7th, it could be the day that the actual Torah is given? Some of this conversation feels as loose as that, even though that's not the main suggestion. They're simply trying to find out which date. We're not going to hang a lot tonight in the actual text where they work out which exact day it is, because there's a lot of calendaring going on. I'm not going to stop. And if we were stitching every piece of limud together and trying to follow whose opinion was which, and it jived with that sage, which is what the Gemara likes to do, we could go ahead and see that certain rabbis went with Rabbi Yossi's opinion, and certain rabbis went with the sage's opinion. Tonight, I'm interested in the sugya for that overarching those conceptual frameworks that I've spoke about tonight. We'll look a little bit at that, and then we'll pass along and forward to how I branded these 3 sessions, and that is, did God hold the mountain over our head? Were we forced to receive the Torah? And what else does it say about Revelation? Again, before we get to that very famous part of this sugya on page 88. So we're holding on page 86. I'm sharing the screen now. You should see it. All right, let's make sure we're on 86. No, I'm sorry, we're holding on 87. And on 87, we just read, and here, by the way, here was the reminder that Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis had a disagreement about when Rosh Chodesh was, but they all agree that it's revealed on a Shabbat, the Torah. And here's where we left off. Amar Lacha Rabbi Yossi. Here's what Rabbi Yossi says. Yom Echad Hosif Moshe mi da'ato. Of his own accord, as Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it, based on his own perception, Moses added a day. Now, what did he add a day to? Just to remind ourselves, in chapter 19 of the book of Exodus, God said, get the people ready, separate the men and the women, Yom Umachar, today and tomorrow. Today and tomorrow, that sounds like 2 days. But Moses said, get ready for 3 days. What did Moses do? Of his own accord, he said 3 days. Or because of his, or based on his perception, he adds a day. Titania, as it says in a Braita, that is a text that is as ancient as the Mishnah and has a lot of authority. Shlosha Devarim Asa Moshe Midato. 3 different times Moses acted on his own accord, or from his own perception, decided to act in a way that God had not exactly commanded. And what did God do? V'hiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu imo. And God agreed with Moses entirely. What did Moses do? What are the 3 things? Hosif Yom Echad Midato. He added a day of separation before the revelation at Sinai. Uferesh min ha'isha. And he totally separated from his wife, Tzipporah, after the revelation at Sinai, meaning he would not any longer be building a family with her and be intimate with her, according to tradition. Veshiber et haluchot, and he broke the tablets following the sin of the golden calf. So these 3 were done by his own accord, or according to his own perception. Now look over here at the noted Steinsaltz. He added 1 day. The question can be raised. If he arrived at this conclusion by expounding upon the command of God, and if all of God's statements were given to Israel for the purpose of expounding upon them, why is this considered to have been based on his own perception? Although God was aware that Moses could arrive at this conclusion, and he gave him leeway to do so, he was in no way required to do so. And he could have concluded that an additional day was unnecessary. So the Ramban has a nice answer to someone who says, what's so big about Moses deciding if God gives us Torah in order to have the very first rabbi in our lives make an interpretation and add a little bit of a fence around the Torah, meaning he adds a day so that we really take care of business, just in case anybody's hedging and they missed a part of the day. Now you got 2 that God commanded, but I'm going to give you 3 so that just in case you started a little late, you didn't get up in time, you're really going to be able to fulfill 2 days. And this is my way of doing and helping you, Joe Jew, to make sure you have fulfilled the word of God so you can receive the Torah at Sinai. Ramban says he didn't have to do that. Now, several times in the Torah, there's a little bit of this going on. I'll give you another instance where it's surprising to me that it's not in this paragraph. We hear about Moses needing to make another decision, midato, from what he perceives, or by his own accord. Shlach lecha anashim. Send forward spies to spy out the land of Canaan. Rashi comes along and quotes another midrash and says what was happening there is that God explained, if you would like to send spies into the land, that's up to you. Maybe because God knows 10 of them are going to come back and really be so afraid and report that there are giants there and we're only grasshoppers in their eyes, and then we're going to get crushed. So there is another place. Now, what that says to us as readers who know some of Rashi and who are learning this Gemara is that this is not a lone soldier here, this midrash. This has got parallels within other texts and midrashim. But the three that are here are, he adds the day, he separates from his wife. That's related to this whole discussion of the separation of men and women before the Torah to begin with. And in that vein, we're asking the question, is this really kosher? Didn't they come back together after the giving of the Torah? Why aren't you, Moses, following the very teaching that we have in the world? That you do have time of separation, but you also have time of rejoining your loved one. You have the idea of family time of sanctification through no physical touching, and then you have a physical coming together again. So that could be the reason why number 2 is number 2 in this list of 3. But breaking the tablets, that's because we're really talking about the tablets being a metonymic device for all the Torah. Or are they? When I break the tablets, am I really breaking the Torah? Am I fundamentally dissociating myself because I have some written form, in this case, stone tablets of Torah, that I break? Was there a purpose to this breaking? Why did God really agree to this if they were just given these holy, handmade, written by the finger of God tablets that you would think would be preserved by all means, by the holiest teacher we have, to say here they're coming from Shemayim, here they're coming from heaven, or this is the word from heaven that's on these tablets. I was asked to write it. Either which way, whatever way you think that this really happened, that there could be an agreement that he broke the tablets. And the Gemara is going to now ask, okay, why? How? How now? How did he do this on his own accord? How could Hashem agree? So that's what's going to be next in the midst of the text. So the Gemara looks at the cases. Hosif Yom Echad Midato. He added one day based on his own perception. Okay, my Daresh. So what source did he interpret that led him to do so? What a rabbinic question. Let's just stop and appreciate. That's the question of the rabbis. If he made the decision to add a third day to the Haggalah, to the separation before the giving of the Torah at Sinai, he must have had a source, right? You want to understand how rabbinic culture works, or how rabbinic hermeneutics at least works in the Gemara, you need to understand that this has to come from a source. We need to understand what his source was. And so we're going to ask that question, and now we're going to have a quote. Because the Holy One, blessed be God, said what? Hayom umachar. The Holy One said, sanctify them today, meaning separate them, in this case, today and tomorrow. And af hayom leilo imo. And listen to this one. This is a really good Jewish way of explaining the world. Today and tomorrow. The juxtaposition of these two teaches that today is like tomorrow. Just as tomorrow the men and women will separate for that day and the night preceding it, so too today requires separation for the day and the night preceding it. So now, Ma lamachar leilo imo af hayom leilo imo v'layla deha'ida dana nafkale. Shma mina trei yaime levar mehe'idana. Uminalan dehiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yado. Delo shar yeshchina ad safra de shabta. So we say the juxtaposition of the 2 days teaches that today is like tomorrow. Hayom is like tomorrow. So what is that already going to hint you into? That today and tomorrow come as one, but really those are 2 of our days. Just as tomorrow the men and women will separate for that day and night preceding it, so too today requires separation for the day and night preceding it. And since God spoke to him in the morning, and the night of that day already passed, because he's going to come down at dawn, remember? And tell everybody. Moses concludes, derived from it, that separation must be in effect for 2 days besides that day, which is going to be the day called Hayom. Therefore, he extends the mitzvah of separation by 1 day. And from where do we derive that the Holy One, blessed be God, agreed with that interpretation? It's derived from the fact that the divine presence did not rest upon Mount Sinai until when? Ad Safra de Shabta, until the morning of Shabbat. So there we have the idea that when I'm calculating and you tell me, do it today and tomorrow, he thought today and tomorrow, that all comes like in a package. Hayom kamachar, today is like tomorrow, therefore day 1 is like today and tomorrow, and day 2 is the next day, therefore it's 3. Yes, it's a little bit pushing the boundaries of how I hear you tell me. In other words, you'll do it today and tomorrow. If already some time has passed today, I'm saying to myself, oh, today means maybe today plus today and tomorrow to get to Shabbat, according to the Shita that starts him enough outward on the calendar days so that he ultimately back up to the chart, so that he ultimately can understand now chapter 19. So the new moon comes on a Sunday. Moses ascends and descends the mountain and says, you shall be to me a holy people. Moses ascended and descended the mountain, commanded the mitzvah of setting boundaries on a Tuesday. So now Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday are the 3 days. Because Wednesday, in like a part of it, becomes everything, because it didn't have the full nighttime. He came down in the morning. So now I have 2 full days, Thursday and Friday, and I get the revelation on Shabbat. As opposed to the Chachamim, which is in the tan here, or the beige, where the mitzvah of separating men and women came on this 4th. That counted as 1 full day, as opposed to Hayom Machar being 2, plus 3. It's 1 Hayom, 2 Machar, the next day, then revelation at Sinai. So really the Shita with 3 days is Rabbi Yossi. Whereas the rabbis tell them here to do it on a Thursday, Thursday day 1, Friday day 2, finally revelation. God agreed to it because of Moses's read of what he was telling him by way of the words that he was using. Now, before we go on, I wonder if anybody else has had sometimes a little bit of a funky understanding of calendar based on, you'll tell them today and tomorrow to do such a thing, and that extends to 3 days. Anybody else in the world say, tell them Hayom and the next day, today and tomorrow to do this? What might I think as a leader? Well, you mean today and tomorrow as in, absolutely, I run from my office right now, tell them today is day 1? and then there's only a Mahar, day 2? Or you mean I should make preparations in my mind, tell everybody, okay, I'm kind of like in the midst of my mid-morning, it's going to be today and tomorrow, meaning it's really not today, it's really tomorrow and the next day. How do I possibly get there from what we just read? Because Moses had this creative way of thinking about these 2 words in the Torah. We just heard the best proof the rabbis could bring. Not sure that it means ultimately 3 days, but now the phrase Hayom Machar, if that's the case, by way of Mosaic teaching and standards, can mean 3 days. God agrees in this case. So whereas I have vocabulary that has a standardized way of being defined, and I have a standardized way of communicating with you, and you have a standardized way of communicating with me, if Moses happens to interpret the words a little differently, Moses has that right, and God ultimately agreed. That's what it boils down to. Now, is that a veneration of Moses? Because like the Ramban was suggesting, that Rabbi Steinsaltz suggested in his translation, that God gave us everything to be interpreted? I like that. Why? Because already we can, in our read of the Torah, claim that of the moments even before Torah is given on Sinai, the very model we have is God speaks words that seem really clear today and tomorrow, or tell them one day, then another day. But my interpretation of the communication, if I'm Moses, and they're therefore making a model for Torah teachers, that sometimes I need to be interpretive of the words, and I at least need to put fences around them, or I need to say that phrase in this case means something a little different. And that's a very Jewish way of thinking. It's kind of like, I'll tell you on a different level of life. I'm sorry, your child is waitlisted. Oh, you mean right now I can call you and really discuss my child's status regarding your school and whether or not they really deserve to be part of the institution, and how many times have you let somebody else in if they're on the wait list, and what kind of conversation can I have about this word wait list that brings us into a little bit more of a how long am I waiting period, and can I shorten it? So I don't know with whom that resonates and with whom it doesn't, if that's kind of the same thing or it isn't here. But I'd love, before we go on to the next little piece of this midrash, and the reason why God agrees, if you've got any thoughts or reflections yourself, I'll take them, because never is a passage of Gemara absolutely positively read in its entirety without somebody making a little bit of a comment. Like the Ramban had what to say, so do we. Lahavdil. We always can say a little something. Yeah, Barry? Bobby? Were you coming off mute to say something?
Yeah, a couple of comments. One is, this does look like, to me, the first fence. And the question of the legitimacy of a fence, because a fence really is ignoring the prescription and creating something different. So I think the issue of accepting the notion of offense, which we're led to believe is accepted here, I think opens up, obviously, an infinite variety of offenses, which frankly I don't think has served our people well, in terms of the variations in fences being interpreted as defining legitimacy. So I think that opens up a very big can of worms that we just saw get opened. I think the second thing that occurs to me, I know we haven't gotten to discussing numbers 2 and 3 yet, but it doesn't look to me as if 1, 2, and 3 are parallel issues, meaning we're supposed to be talking about Moses's own recognizance, right? His own essentially judgment. To be honest, I don't remember anything in the Torah about separation after revelation, or Moses separating or not separating from his wife. So I'll be interested to hear where that comes from. But the third thing is, if we take number 1 as setting a precedent, I don't think number 3 in any way matches that. The breaking of the tablets, I think, is to some extent a very, very different act. Not to say that I don't understand, the passion and why Moses did it as a human being, but the idea that somehow that fits into this same category seems to me a very, very big stretch. So, I'm saying those are just the reactions I had to what you presented.
Okay, good. So I agree with you that sometimes fences around the Torah can be very, very much a way of judging whether or not someone takes on more strictures and has a lot more kind of fences around what it means to, what we would call, I guess, live life like a Jew and as a functioning citizen of the world, and maybe creates too high a fence in a certain kind of way of looking at it, or could create a pre-shoot, an asceticism in some way that the rabbis were not really interested in. And Rabbi Eliezer Diamond of the seminary wrote a great book about how some of the fences that were created within law and some of the fences around asceticism itself that the Torah provides for, to give people an encouragement to engage and embrace life and a little bit more of their agency and free will, that we could really see it as being central to the conversation about how this life of living God's will through lived halakha will play out, either towards our benefit and the mutual benefit of ourselves and others in our communities and even peoples of the world in the relationships we have. So I'm with you on that one. The associations of these two other teachings, I appreciate your commenting about, because I was trying to see if there were any parallels or if they were related. But I'll just say about the second one, which we haven't gotten to yet, we're not really given a lot of information about this tradition that Moses separated from his wife, except to say that they assert it here and in another midrash. And they use that in the section of the book of Numbers to say why Aaron and Miriam really were challenging Moses. It wasn't in regard to his black wife. It was to the way that he had blackened the relationship with his wife, meaning that people kind of called this a sense of he created a wall of separation between a void between him and his wife, this black space that was not real and human. And so they may not even be pushing that language into the focus. I may be pushing that in just to say, what do we do then with the idea that they said that Cushite woman that you married, and it sounds like they were really in some way attacking her. But this idea that he wasn't living up to the standards of a good husband and a family man, this is on the table here from this midrash and from other sources that claim this without a whole lot of background, without a whole lot of textual proof as well. Yeah, Dale.
I can't say that I followed the logic that Moses had, but it certainly sets the precedent of questioning our teachers and our rabbis and arguing. If Moses can figure out, decide what he thinks God means, can everybody figure out what God meant? And that certainly is the background for the Talmudic discourse that we read. On the third item, just to finish, I always thought that God was angry at Moses for breaking the 10 Commandments, and that was why he had to write the second set. God wasn't going to do it for him. But it's interesting that they're making Moses a hero and infallible in this statement.
Yeah, well, wait till you hear what is said about that very act, because that creates a legacy for us, and we use some of the terminology within our Jewish lives that come out of that little sugya and hearing about how God does agree. So I appreciate that gloss, because it could very well be that someone thinks God was very upset with Moses for doing just that, for breaking it. But yeah, as a way of saying that the foundational relationship with Torah is that we begin to interpret what seems like pretty straightforward words, and that at the basis of determining God's will in the world, we need interpreters, and the wisdom of Moses, or those empowered by receiving smicha, by ultimately being ordained in the Mosaic tradition of being the rabbis, because we call Moses Moshe Rabbeinu within our system, Moses, our teacher, our rabbi. Yeah, so that is the positive side of saying, yeah, sometimes we will have to add. What of the times that we have to kind of reduce? What of the times that we're going to be makil, a little bit more lenient, versus the times that we're machmir, that we are more stringent? And that gets into some of what I think Barry was bringing forward, that a lot of stringencies may not have served us so well. But those are outlooks that have really informed even modern movements, which direction we go. How interpretive can we be? How lenient, how stringent within a certain modern movement, when the movements were really central to the project of Jewish peoplehood? And in today's world, which communities living Torah are celebrating this for the possibilities it offers, or just further restricting the kind of nature of what it called for, that is a restriction, let's say, of numbers of days between separating the sexes, or the separation of the sexes just in general as an issue in the Jewish world. Take the buses in Jerusalem for a good example, and whether or not that spills over into other parts of Israeli society that may not want it, or in Brooklyn, and how we deal with that. So these are the kinds of things that are implicated within the discussions of these great passages, but they can be part of the discussion, say the rabbis, because we have the text here in the Talmud, a tradition that doesn't want us to even debate about whether or not we're allowed to interpret God's word and will, would not include this kind of text. And so I think that in many ways, we're getting ready for Revelation with this text included. Before we get to the page on which the Torah will be given, this is the warm-up text. This is getting us into the cultural milieu that the rabbis want us to feel a part of as we get towards this version of Revelation. All right, back to the text. Next item. Uferesh min ha'isha. My darish. What source did he interpret that led him to do so? Nasa kal v'chomer ba'atzmo. He reasoned with an a fortiori inference by himself, and said the following: Umma Yisrael shelo dibra shechina imahen ela sha'a achat v'kava lehen zaman amra Torah v'hayu nechonim, etc. Al tikshu ani shekol sha'a v'sha'a shechina medaberet imi ve'eno kovea li zaman alachat kama v'kama. He says, if Israel, the whole people, right? The tradition is that all of Israel was going to merit to receive the Torah all at once as a whole entire nation, with whom the divine presence spoke only one time. So at Sinai, this whole family was ready to receive the divine presence and God's word, and God set a specific time for them when the divine presence would be revealed. And the Torah states, prepare yourselves for 3 days, do not approach a woman. By the way, prepare yourselves for 3 days. Well, that's now using the insertion of Moses's 3 days. So we know that that verse, Exodus 19:15, says, prepare yourselves hayom u'machar, today and tomorrow, but it's already now accepted in the idiomatic translation. Prepare yourselves for 3 days, do not approach a woman. This is the preparation phase for the revelation of the Torah. Moses says, if that's the case, that the entire family of Israel was given a certain day on which they were going to get Torah, and they had to separate for 3 days beforehand, I, who could receive the word of Torah any given time from the divine presence, the Shekhinah is going to call out to me at any given time. So I have to be ready. And I therefore have to be separated from my wife at all times. And from where do we derive that the Holy One, blessed be God, agreed with him that he should do this? Dichtiv lech emor lahem shuvu lechem la'oholechem. It's because God said, return to your tents, meaning to your homes and your wives. And afterwards, since I have a progression of verses that say to the people who came to speak with Moses or who were there present, go back to your homes and tents, but it says about Moses specifically, uchativ batre va'ata po omedi madi, but you stay here and stand with me. Since it says that in Deuteronomy, Moses ultimately would not be allowed to return home. Ve'ita amri pe el pe adaberbo. And some say a different source was indicating that God agreed with his reasoning. Because when Moses and the rest of the family is there, Aaron and Miriam in that Numbers chapter that I mentioned, here's where the tradition is that in Numbers they were indeed challenging him for this issue. With him do I speak mouth to mouth, God says, not in some dreamscape, not in some dark space or speeches, not in a cloud or any other way. Mouth to mouth, I speak with Moses. So were you not then afraid to speak against Moses for making sure that he was in this constant state of purity and I could be ready to speak to him mouth to mouth at any given time? What gave you the right? You know that you had to separate 3 days before I gave you the Torah on Sinai. So here is what's shocking, that we say God agreed with him, that he separated entirely from his wife for this purpose. And we get to the next, broke the tablets, but I'm not going to go. I'm going to just stop here for a minute because we get one paragraph to deal with this tradition. Don't know if that's satisfying, Barry, about any given reason. But the given reasons were, A, since he realized that God needed separation before a communication of Torah, he ought to be separate and let God at any given moment be able to bring the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and communicate. Or they use this other one, the Numbers story, whereas God spoke to everybody else in all kinds of different ways. Mouth to mouth, he's ready to speak to Moses, and Moses can't possibly have gone home to his tent and had been with his wife. Now, I'm going to say one last word before I get comments. It's a very, quote unquote, let's say, got its own slippery slope or even dangerous. in a class that I had with Professor Charlotte von Robert, who we spoke about last week, who wrote all about men's and women's bodies and carnal Israel, and carnal Israel being a title of a book by Professor Daniel Boyarin, and how embodied a people we are, and how celebratory of physical embodiment we are, and the loving relationship of men and women. At that, he has problems with such a text because it sounds like leaders ought to be celibate and separated from their families. And that was a whole different way that some folks went with thinking about religious leadership. And that's not our way. And so what winds up happening here is, in the tradition, they say this was unique to Moses only. And the reason why the Gemara is telling us that God supported his decision is because God only supported Moses doing this and nobody else. And that will be some of the writings we will hear in terms of the question about whether or not rabbis should or shouldn't marry, sages should or shouldn't marry. While in the early development of early Christianity, they were developing celibacy as a policy.
So I'm impressed with the creativity of the interpretation, but I'm not convinced at all. And the reasons I'm not convinced, you may have heard Bobby say, what about poor Zipporah? Why is she the victim here? But I'd also point out that this flies in the face of the Brit with Abraham. We are the most pro-creation religion in terms of a commitment to winding up with lots of us around. And so the idea that you take your highest leader and wind up with that person not being able to have progeny seems to me not at all convincing as being consistent with the fundamental principles. So again, I think, as I said, I'm really impressed that they could come up with this analysis, but I think it fails on the two fronts of the responsibility of a husband to a wife. Then he should have divorced her so she could have, she could have had a relationship with another man, rather than denying her rights. So that's not going down well with me, and I don't think it would go down well with Bobby either. So that's one opinion. But I understand the creativity. I appreciate the creativity.
Barry and Bobby, if you can hear me and you're in earshot,
I'm right here.
I don't think he's saying that just because he comes to Talmud class with you. I think absolutely, Barry, this is one of the most challenging pieces we have of Gemara. And when it comes to wondering about whether or not we should have gone down the road of celibacy for leaders, actually it's here because we want to be challenged. The rabbis want to challenge this notion. And I believe very deeply in the fact that sometimes the rabbis will be provocateurs, and they will include texts that indeed make us react this way, make us have empathy for Tzipporah, make us have second thoughts about some of the other choices out there in terms of the way religious leadership would be developed in the world. And so too did it take a lot of time and hundreds of years, centuries, until the time that priestly leadership was challenged by other forms of ministerial leadership within the world of Christendom. But this idea of celibacy was real. It was real among early ascetics as well, even before the Jewish Christian paths were defined so intensely. And in the early, more aesthetic and ascetic versions of religious practice, of certain monkish type of religions that it developed in Egypt. Not to go into a whole history, but this idea of separating was in the air, that it was very priestly and or just simply an ascetic practice that would lead one to a closer relationship with a higher pantheon of gods in certain places, or a one god in the most ancient kind of monotheistic tradition of Egypt that we can tease out of knowing some of the history there. And it may have really informed the Essene community at the Dead Sea. And where those folks did not have family life and children, and that, as you called it, covenantal arrangement that God made with Abraham and Sarah to be fruitful, multiply, and be as numerous as the stars. And so what were the interpretations of those texts given by those people? It was a little bit more along the lines that the stars mentioned, and this push towards having offspring was to say that one needed to have teachings in the world that would create light. And that was kind of parallel to those religions who used forces of light to overcome forces of darkness. So there is a trend here at the Talmudic time of hitting this tradition head on to avoid and thwart this sensibility of leadership. And there might have been some leftover ideas that this was going to get us closer to the will of God, which is only appropriate in the passages about the Jewish people standing at Sinai, receiving Torah, and wondering about whether or not every soul could receive some notion of communication from God, be ready for it, and open for it, and to it, and whether or not that continues, and with whom it could continue. So I think it's there to ultimately reject it. But I do believe that it's about some of the sensibilities. Do we need then some alone time with God, as opposed to thinking of ourselves always on the horizontal level in relationship with people? And how will we achieve that if it is not through either the religious leadership or ourselves as individuals ready at the mountain, ready to receive Torah? How will we achieve a little bit of that time where we are intimate with the Holy One? Okay, so the next one, oh, Dale, before we go on.
Just one quick response. He already had at least one child by now.
Yeah.
So this isn't about not having children. It's about, and it's not clear. Is it about for a short period of time not being with your wife, or forever not being with your wife?
Good. It's a good refinement vis-a-vis Moses' life. But one, I guess I'm recommending that one read it as being able to extrapolate the idea that those closest to seeing, speaking, hearing from God, the revelation at hand, might require separation, men from women entirely. But you're right. The context being that he had family first and then went on to do this might be another way to read it.
I can't help but point out, Rabbi, because every year it's on in the Hertz, it's on the same facing pages in the Hertz interpretation. On the right side, it says he speaks directly to God face to face. On the left side, it says that God has to put him in a crook in the rock because he can't see his face, because he'll die if he sees his face.
That's right.
So I find that at least the English juxtaposition every year makes me smile.
And we'll add to it the numbers juxtaposition where it's mouth to mouth. And so we have all of these different kinds of ways that are represented for the communication between Moses and God that make us think too about how it is that we feel we are ultimately in relationship with the Holy One, and how distinct and unique that is with Moses. All right, so let's get to this third teaching of the night. He broke the tablets. Shiberet haluchot. We know that following the sin of the golden calf, Moses comes down the mountain, thrusts the luchot, and breaks them. My dareish. We have the same question as we had twice before. That is, what is the source for that? How did Moses ultimately come to the conclusion? How did he understand that he could make such a decision? What perception, what did he perceive? Of his own accord, he broke the tablets and God agreed. Amar, he said to himself, Moses, Uma Pesach shehu echad mitaryag mitzvot amra Torah v'chol ben nechar lo yochal bo haTorah kula v'Yisrael mishumadim alachat kama v'kama. So with regard to the Paschal lamb, the Torah says, take this lamb, make it your Paschal offering, right? Which is only one of 613 mitzvahs. The Torah stated, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Paschal offering. No alien shall eat of it. That's referring not only to Gentiles, but to apostate Jews as well, in the way that the law has been interpreted within Tractate Psachim, the tractate of the Talmud about Passover and the Passover laws. So Steinsaltz brings it into the idiomatic translation. Regarding the tablets, which represented the entire Torah, that's where it turns HaTorah Kula, Kan, meaning these tablets of the law, which are metonymic for the entirety of the Torah, 613 mitzvahs, and not just a set of tablets that has a certain number of holy words on them that came to our understanding in terms of God's will. The whole Torah and Israel at that moment were apostates as they were worshiping the calf. All the more so are they not worthy of receiving that whole Torah. Reading it again, if I understand one mitzvah, the Paschal lamb, ultimately being for the Jewish people, but no alien, no apostate, nobody who's acting according to the ways of the Gentiles can have at that moment any connection to the Paschal offering, the two tablets of the law that represent all of the Torah, being that every Jew was worshiping the golden calf and acting like a Gentile at that moment, acting like an apostate. They don't deserve the Torah at all, and therefore I can break the tablets. And how do we know that God agreed with that reasoning? Shenemar, when it says about God observing what Moses did, it uses the words in the Torah in Exodus chapter 34, Asher Shibarta, that you broke. The Amar Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish understands this phrase that God said to Moses, Asher Shibarta in the Hebrew, that you broke. Listen to the sounds, Asher Shibarta. He said it sounds exactly like this. Yishar kochacha sheshibarta. God said, Yishar koach, Moses, you broke the tablets. And as Dale noted, shocking. And we use the term Yishar koach for every time we do a mitzvah. And it comes from the interpretation Reish Lakish made from this phrase that he said to Moses, that you broke. Asher Shibarta, these tablets that you broke. Yishar kochacha, she shibarta. So then we get into the third day, and that's the one paragraph about this instance. Now, is this separate and apart from this notion? Yes. Why? Because you're talking about calling at that moment, you're calling into question the status of the Jewish people. Are they all worthy of receiving this entire Torah that is metonymically represented through these tablets? And this idea that they were God-given, that God didn't want to directly reveal anything, the connection might be to the last piece, is that God is thinking about how God communicates directly with Moses, which is pei lepei. Moses is pure enough. Moses is ready. Moses remains ready. Moses remains intense after the people send him back up the mountain and they go down, intent upon receiving this Torah, and they are kofer be'ikar. They upend the whole notion of the teaching of the Torah that they were granted. Now, what's some of the challenges we could say already about this? One is, could the Jewish people really be called apostates at that time? Did they know from their teacher all of what really was said at Sinai that was represented by the very tablets themselves? Couldn't we have interpreted that Moses was bringing down not only the tablets, but all the Torah, as our tradition says? He's the teacher who received all of Torah, and therefore, did they really understand what they were doing when they were worshiping this golden calf? Did they hear the second commandment, though, of you shouldn't worship any idols, shouldn't make any molten images? Did they go and then say to themselves, let's make one until Moses comes back, because that might keep everybody around the camp and we'll all have these kind of sacred dances? Hey, wait a minute. Didn't Moses actually add a third day when we heard God say, because Moses reported to us, Hayom u'machar, didn't Moses add a third day? Couldn't we add a little? Isn't there space here for making some image of this kind of representation of godliness that we know from our Egyptian experience, from the local Canaanites? Maybe some of them were mixed in because there's a mixed multitude. Who knows where this came from? Well, for sure, God doesn't agree with them. And for sure, this passage of the text says God for sure agreed with Moses that this was no way to behave. These were apostates now. They were in the category of apostate Jews. And he breaks the tablets, and God says, Yishar koach. Now, in a minute, Moses is going to argue, erase me from this book if you're going to wipe everybody else out. He doesn't accept the fact that everybody is an apostate, that everybody else is a quote-unquote non-citizen of Israel. It's not as though he wants that to stick. But the reasoning in the moment made him act. And last note before I'll take a comment, sometimes a text, a source, and here's what I think, again, a positive message about this moment of Moses's decision-making could represent within the greater tradition. Sometimes we let a verse guide our decision for a certain behavior at that moment, and if you will, never again. There is a moment when I can live out a certain verse that ultimately will be the answer just for this one time. Example, somebody might say in the Gemara, there's no wall that ever separates between God and the Jewish people. And someone who's living at a time of a pandemic might say that if I'm connected to another person on another balcony and walls are between us, we're still in the same space for our prayer service. So during such a time as a pandemic, we were able to say that people were together in the space of prayer, even though we weren't sitting physically in the same space. That's using a Talmudic line to actually get to a moment of needing to interpret for the moment. This is how we acted. This is how we prayed. Moses himself hears from God. Yes, you acted in such a way as to live out the idea of the 10 Commandments, that the people would be cut off from God and Torah if they made a molten image, a graven image, and Moses breaks these tablets at that moment to say, you're not worthy of Torah if this is how you're going to behave, if this is the kind of worship you're going to engage in. And he breaks the tablets, and God says, Asher Shibarta, or as Reish Lakish says, Yishar Kochacha. And so there could be a moment where that's right. It could be only for a moment and never again. And so that text could stand to be representative of such a moment within a Torah teacher's purview.
Well, if no one else is saying anything, I'll say my comment. So I would have thought this is God's decision, not Moses's. God knew what was going on down in the camp, as well as Moses, and probably knew it before Moses. I don't remember enough about the sequence or the Talmudic interpretation as to whether or not the people have already gotten the commandments at this point about the idolatry in quite the formal way. But again, I think having gotten away with the first the first reinterpretation of God's literal word, I think Moses is emboldened to be acting on his own recognizance, if we will, here. And I'm not saying, as I said before, I understand it because Moses is a human. He's not a god, and he's not endowed with the restraint of God. But I think it's pretty clear that if Moses really thinks these people are apostates that are beyond ever receiving the law, then, as you already pointed out, his arguments with God to protect them and to ultimately forgive them is actually inconsistent. Now, obviously, maybe he had a change of heart or something, but I think we have to really stretch for finding a consistent thread that runs through all of that.
Yeah. Just so you have the general understanding, though we could be really, really close readers of the text and argue that different chapters come here or there before one or another, there's no later or earlier or later in the Torah, according to some who really move chapters around and in their narrative sense of this text, move things to fit just this way or so. It is understood that since the Sinai experience is in chapter 20 and the golden calf experience is in chapter 32, that we ultimately get a real way to think about the Israelites reacting at least to the 10 Commandments. He goes back up the mountain, Moses, to get the tablets that God is preparing. And that's the way the tradition generally sees that chronology. So that's just as a side note.
But if God was happy with him breaking the tablets the first time, he makes him write it the second time rather than having God write it, which seems to me, I always interpreted that perhaps as maybe a minor punishment.
Interesting. I've always studied that text at Shavuot times with certain groups, and what rises out of understanding chapter 34 often, if it's not a punishment, which is a possibility, is that God needed to show the Jewish people that indeed there was a partnership and that it would take human effort, interpretation, and dedication to God's word. And this started a legacy of textual productivity within and among the Jewish people. So that's a positive way to potentially see that. Any other last comments about this section before I give you one last nugget? and until the next time and the last session for this section of the of the Route 66. Okay.
I just wanted to ask you, when they say aliens and apostates, were there with them some of the non-Jews that left out of Egypt? So there would have been aliens in the group, and also because they did come out of Egypt, they would be considered apostates.
So what you have, the total, the Jews who reject Judaism even before they leave Egypt wind up staying behind. And there's a tradition that we have many, many Jews that stay behind. Whether it was 4 of 5, whether it was X%, we can't exactly answer. There are different traditions. Then there's a mixed multitude who comes out of Egypt, who are not yet totally Jewish and remain that in some way, that in that way. And that's why the Torah speaks of the ger, asher b'sha'arecha, and the stranger, the sojourner with you. And those folks ultimately receive treatment by the Torah in different ways. And we could make an investigation as to where they are excluded. The ger and the ezrach is one kind of way to distinguish between them. The citizen, which I'm not talking about the citizen, the individual in an enlightened society that has a relationship like a citizen does in a covenantal sort of constitutional arrangement with a government power and leader. Though we are the closest to that, I believe, in the ancient world, and that's why the Bible is so foundational to Enlightenment thinking. The ger ultimately is excluded from the Paschal offering, as we just read in this sense, but then there seems to be a way to actually be inclusive. And that there's another aspect of the text internally. It's an intertextual debate, a dialogue, development, perhaps, where at first they are totally excluded, but then there's a way to include, just like we've talked about in Masechet Brachot, or it was in several other tractates of the Talmud, where there's a servant who, first of all, distinguishes himself as a non-Jew because he's kind of teaching the Chachamim all of this because he loves the Jewish people and he's connected and he prides himself on not being a part of that. But then there is in Masechet Ta'anit, as opposed to Brachot, that Eved, who's within the context of this Ezrach or Ger, citizen or alien, who is halfway there because he's circumcised already. He just hasn't gone to mikveh, but he knows full well how to put the tefillin on and become the 10th in the minyan, if you recall that moment. So there's a lot of loose lines already in the Tanakh and in the Talmudic literature about who's in and who's out, but there are indeed lines, and therefore there's these distinctions that are made, like the one we just were able to understand in this midrash. And then finally, an apostate Jew, that means a lot of different things depending on the moment that a Jew kind of leaves the fray. You have apostates who start believing more in philosophical and other systems of deities. So you have Jews who went the Greek route and they're apostates. And then you have other Jews who are really those who embrace a syncretistic way of thinking about life, where I could worship this God and I could also offer things to this God. And what's so bad? I've got to appease this God who deals with the rain over here, and I've got to deal with this God over here who deals with the rain. So why don't I just worship both? That's also an apostate. And then I have others who were the early Christians who became the Malshinim, who were insulting of the way that we kept the law and what God expected, and those who, even with a certain amount of love and developing a religion of love, thought that we were all about law versus love, and that direction also apostate Jews, those who were no longer in the fray. So we have lots of different ways of looking at these terms if we drill down. So good to just notice those kinds of distinctions in the passages. Okay, let me just do one more little piece because we're going to kind of stop here. It comes back to the discussion about being prepared for the third day, and that Rabbi Yossi has one sense, and didn't Moses add this of his own volition? And didn't Moses have some perception that this was necessary? And now they get into what I was talking about before at the introduction for tonight's shir. On the third day, it was a third day of the month and the third day of the week, and they'll go back and forth and try to figure out which is the day of Rosh Chodesh and which is the day of the week. And remember that above, we already heard that everybody agreed that the Torah was given on Shabbat, and that's kind of what I want to keep in focus and talk about it as I just kind of stroll through here and say just a little bit about this next piece.
I know.
That
That one.
the Gemara asks, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, say to Moses? And what did Moses say to Israel? Remember when we read chapter 19 of Exodus, that there was a reporting of what God said and what Moses then said to Israel, but there wasn't any filling in the blanks. There really was not a reportage about what was actually said. And sometimes the Gemara, in the midst of a sugya, in the midst of this type of an exploration of the bigger issue of Moses's decisions that he made from his own perception, of his own volition, they will get back to this notion of filling in what might have been happening in a certain moment, in a certain chapter, in a certain verse in the Torah. So just to say that this is one of those places where you have some comment on this exchange that seemed to happen and this reporting of Moses to the people of what God said. And this is what gives rise to certain humashim that like to fill in blanks about what was said because it's not really quoted in the Torah in chapter 19. So a certain chumash will be born into existence called the Torah Tamima that takes different sayings or different midrashim or different interpretations of the Talmud itself and will, like Rashi commentary, tell you that from this place in the Talmud, Bavli, from this place in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, we know that this is what was said. This is what was meant. It is a chumash that doesn't just get used by a Rashi type of commentator, because Rashi used all these texts as well, and might just be picking and placing different midrashim to put in his commentary as he's creating lessons for his students and then ultimately for us. But it's actually a Humash that quotes the Gemara directly, the Torah Tamima. And for instance, you would find either above the line or below the line, as we might say for the Torah Tamima, that this Gemara comes about chapter 19. And it says the verses do not elaborate on the content of God's command to Moses, which Moses then told the people and which they accepted. It must be that this refers to the mitzvah of setting boundaries. So there must have been a whole big discussion beforehand. It's not like Moses made the decision and then God had to come and say, you're okay. This was what they were talking about up there. They were debating halacha. They were debating whether or not there was a 2-day period or should have been a 3-day period. And that's the statement of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, at first, now listen to this, he explained the punishment and the hardship involved in receiving the Torah. Oh, now it wasn't the halachic discussion that was actually the discussion Moses and God were having, that Moses was going to tell the people about. Now, here's where we get into a little bit of the picture of the whole Torah and what it means to accept and receive the Torah, all of it, for the Jewish people. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is obviously interested in reporting this broader matter after Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says it was really about the particular mitzvah of setting boundaries. So Yehuda Nasi brings us in, and he broadens our horizons. He widens the vista, and he says, at first he explained the punishment and the hardship involved in receiving the Torah. B'tchila peresh onsha, dichti vayashev Moshe, devarim shem mishabevin da'ato shel adam. Ulevasof peresh matan tzchara, dichtiv vayaged Moshe, devarim shem moshchin libo shel adam ka'agada. It says that at first he explains the punishment and the hardship involved in receiving the Torah as it's written, and Moses reported, which is interpreted homiletically as matters that shatter mishabevin, a person's mind. Oh, so difficult will sometimes this Torah be. We'll have to really work hard at figuring this out. It will knock our socks off. It will blow our minds. It will stir our hearts. It will make us mishuga ladavar, literally mishuga ladavar. We'll be mishuga for the words of Torah. We have to really figure that out. That in and of itself is punishment, but it will also be is the reward, because Moses told them that is, it will be like matters that draw a person's heart to God, the Torah, and to, of course, living a life full of heart, I think is the implication, like Agadah. We will have legends and stories, and people will be able to read inside Torah and understand not just punishments and rewards. Even if you have a doctrine that you shouldn't do anything for a reward, the idea here is that people should feel rewarded, and there might be sometimes that you have to live with a sense that I'm not living up to this. There is such a thing as chet, sin, and avera, transgression, and I might have had those first, and they do shatter a person's mind in some ways. I don't know if I can live with this, but then there will be the agada. Then there will be the telling of the tales that are as wide as the father and the mother tell the children at the Seder table, because anytime you use the word agada, you're talking about vehigada talabincha. You're going to tell the tales of our ancestors. You're going to tell the tales of our going out of Egypt. You're going to tell the tales of the heroes of our people. And there are those who say it went the other way. At first, talked about the reward of Torah. Dichti vayashev Moshe devarim shemishivin da'ato shel adam. He says, when it says the verb is vayashev Moshe, and he returned to tell the people what God was talking about, then he returned to really tell people that God will really calm your heart. Vayashev Moshe devarim shemishivim da'ato shel adam. This brings you a certain level of the deepest soul tranquility that I could imagine. And it will bring you into a relationship. When you say mishivin in the Gemara, when you say and you use the word vayashev, you're obviously talking also tshuva. And tshuva is turning towards God, and God turning towards you. And if you meet God halfway, God meets you the other half. This is the kind of implication within this kind of use of the agadic system, that every time the word is used and they say it means this, there's also all these other beautiful kind of word cloud associations that I can make. Ulvasof peresh onsha. You first start out with telling people that surely the Torah will bring you tranquility and bring you a sense of soul calmness and returning towards divinity, and God will turn towards you. Ulvasof peresh onsha. And at the end, there's also the discussion of what it means to live with consequences and punishments. Dichti vayaged Moshe, that when it says vayaged, devarim shekashin la'adam kagidin, it is as difficult as for a person as wormwood, and that is a certain type of wood that seems to have a very, very serious hardness. So we get a little sense that Yehuda Nasi is interested in the bigger picture of Torah Kula, of all the Torah. It wasn't that Moses went up the mountain simply to talk about whether or not it was halachically permissible to make a 3-day versus a 2-day Hagbala, separation between the men and the women for the preparedness. It is that people should understand either which direction. There's a lot of toil involved in Torah. There's some great reward. There's also consequences. And all this will bring you into a relationship with the divine and calm your heart and bring you to a sense of Torah tranquility. Now, Torah tranquility might be a little different than simply like, the meditative asceticism that some might feel we're talking about when we use a word like tranquility. Torah tranquility is very different, I think. And with that, Asher Shibarta, Yishar Kochacha, Yishar Koch, that you broke your teeth, your mind, your heart, all of whatever you're breaking on this Torah, so that we could come to a closer place to the mountain. So we could, next time, we're going to deal with the revelation itself on the page that comes. Okay? Lila Tov, so good to learn with you.
It's quite an amazing situation.